In the spring of the year 1889, a cotton merchant by the name of James Maybrick fell gravely ill. Within a fortnight, he was dead. The circumstances of his passing were deemed suspicious, and an inquest determined that arsenic poisoning was the cause. Attention fell immediately upon his young American wife, Florence Elizabeth Maybrick, who was thereupon arrested, tried, and convicted of his willful murder. If you hold interest in historical stories, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and press the bell button. The story commences not in Liverpool, but upon the Atlantic Ocean, in the month of March of the year 1880. James Maybrick, a cotton merchant then 41 years of age, was returning to England from the port of Norfolk in the Commonwealth of Virginia, where he had maintained a branch office of his firm, Maybrick and Company. He had embarked upon the steamship Baltic in New York on the 12th of March, bound for Liverpool. During the 6-day passage, he was introduced to Florence Elizabeth Chandler, a young woman of 18 years from Mobile in the state of Alabama, who was travelling in the company of her mother, the Baroness Caroline von Roques. Miss Chandler was described as a strawberry blonde of 5 feet 3 inches, with blue eyes and a manner that impressed those who made her acquaintance. Notwithstanding the considerable disparity in their ages, 3 and 20 years separated them. A romantic attachment formed with remarkable swiftness during that brief voyage. By the time the vessel reached Liverpool on the 18th of March, an understanding had been reached between them, and plans for marriage were already in contemplation. The wedding took place on the 27th of July, 1881, in London. It was described as a fashionable ceremony, and the couple thereafter established themselves in Liverpool, where Mr. Maybrick's business interests were chiefly concentrated. In March of the following year, Mrs. Maybrick gave birth prematurely to a son, James Chandler Maybrick, known within the family by the affectionate diminutive Bobo. The birth occurred some 8 months after the wedding, a circumstance that was noted but did not appear to occasion particular remark in the records. For a period, the family divided their time between Norfolk and Liverpool, as Mr. Maybrick's business required his attendance on both sides of the Atlantic. However, by the year 1884, declining opportunities in the cotton trade prompted him to resign from the Norfolk Cotton Exchange and to return permanently to England. The Mayricks settled first in the suburb of Grassendale, and in July of 1886, a second child was born, a daughter, Gladys Evelyn. The family thereafter moved to Battlecrease House in Aigburth, a detached residence of some substance befitting a man of Mr. Maybrick's position in Liverpool society. Outwardly, the household presented an appearance of prosperity and respectability, but beneath that surface, strains were accumulating that would presently come to light under circumstances of the most public and distressing nature. James Maybrick was not a man of simple habits or uncomplicated health. In the year 1877, during his residence in Norfolk, he had contracted malaria. The initial treatment with quinine proving unsuccessful, a physician prescribed a preparation containing arsenic and strychnine. While such treatment may appear extraordinary by modern medical standards, it was not uncommon in that era. A preparation known as Fowler's medicine, which contained arsenic, was widely regarded as a healthful tonic, and arsenic was believed by some to possess properties conducive to vitality and vigour. Mr. Maybrick, having commenced this course of medication, did not thereafter discontinue it. On the contrary, he developed a persistent reliance upon arsenic, taking it in various forms and at increasing intervals throughout the remainder of his life. The habit was well known to those who were acquainted with him, and multiple witnesses would later testify to his custom of procuring arsenic preparations from chemists in Liverpool, sometimes requesting doses that exceeded the ordinary therapeutic measure. A chemist by the name of Edwin Garnet Heaton, whose shop was situated in Exchange Street East, later gave evidence that Mr. Maybrick had been a frequent customer for a period of 18 months prior to 1888. Mr. Heaton testified that he had supplied a pick-me-up containing arsenic to Mr. Maybrick, and that the doses had been increased over time from 4 to 7 drops, taken 2 to 5 times daily. This was estimated to be equivalent to approximately 1/3 of a grain of white arsenic per day, a quantity substantial enough to have produced a marked accumulation of the substance within the body over prolonged use. It was further established that Mr. Maybrick was not unique in this practice. Arsenic and strychnine abuse had become fashionable among professional men in both America and Britain during that period. The substance was addictive, and evidence suggested that Mr. Maybrick carried this dependency to his grave. In addition to his reliance upon arsenic, Mr. Maybrick exhibited other habits that placed strain upon the marriage. It was later revealed that he had maintained a long-term association with a woman by the name of Sarah Ann Robertson, who was described in documents as Sarah Ann Maybrick, wife of James, suggesting a common law arrangement of considerable duration. Maybrick had fathered 5 children, a circumstance that was not made known to his wife until some years into the marriage. The discovery of this second household was reported to have caused Mrs. Maybrick considerable distress and indignation. By the year 1888, the marriage had deteriorated markedly. Mrs. Maybrick, who had married at the age of 18 with expectations of comfort and position, found herself in circumstances less agreeable than she had anticipated. Her husband's business affairs were troubled by an economic slump that had affected the cotton trade, and financial anxieties weighed upon the household. Mrs. Maybrick was said to have continued her accustomed expenditures, incurring debts with moneylenders, a matter that occasioned friction between husband and wife. Moreover, Mr. Maybrick's temperament was reported to have grown increasingly difficult. He exhibited signs of what was later described as drug-induced melancholy, including hypochondria, a gloomy disposition, and a violent temper. Servants in the household later testified to quarrels between the couple, and on at least one occasion, Mr. Maybrick was said to have struck his wife, giving her a blackened eye. It was under these strained circumstances that Mrs. Maybrick formed an attachment to a gentleman by the name of Alfred Brierly. The affair was conducted with some degree of indiscretion, and in March of 1889, Mrs. Maybrick and Mr. Brierly spent a night together at a hotel, an act that would later be placed prominently before the court and the public as evidence of her moral character. The relationship with Mr. Brierly was not concealed from all quarters. Mrs. Maybrick had written letters to him of an affectionate and compromising nature, and these letters would subsequently be discovered and produced as exhibits at her trial. It is important to note that while Mrs. Maybrick's infidelity became a matter of intense public and judicial scrutiny, Mr. Maybrick's long-standing maintenance of a second household with another woman was treated as a matter of far less moral consequence. This disparity in treatment reflected the prevailing standards of the age, wherein the conduct of wives was judged by a measure far stricter than that applied to husbands. On the evening of the 29th of March, 1889, a violent quarrel occurred between Mr. and Mrs. Maybrick. The altercation was severe enough that Mr. Maybrick struck his wife, inflicting visible injury. In the days that followed, Mr. Maybrick received a succession of prescriptions from various physicians and chemists. His health, already compromised by years of self-medication, began to decline more precipitously. It was later suggested that he may have taken an overdose of one or more of the preparations upon which he had come to depend. On the 26th of April, 1889, Mr. Maybrick fell seriously ill. His symptoms included severe gastric distress, vomiting, and abdominal pain complaints consistent with a number of ailments, including arsenic poisoning, but also consistent with the effects of prolonged arsenic use and the gastrointestinal disorders to which such use was known to predispose a patient. He visited his physician for the last time on the 3rd of May, and on that same day made the final entry in his personal diary. His condition continued to worsen, and he remained confined to his bed at Battlecrease House. During this period of illness, suspicion began to form in the minds of those attending him. A nurse who had been engaged to care for Mr. Maybrick later testified that she had observed Mrs. Maybrick handling bottles and medicines in what the nurse deemed a furtive manner. Servants in the household also reported instances in which Mrs. Maybrick had been seen near her husband's food and drink. On one occasion, Mrs. Maybrick was observed to have purchased flypapers from a local chemist. Flypapers at that time were coated with arsenic, and it was a known practice among women of the period to soak such papers in water in order to extract the arsenic, which was then used as a cosmetic preparation to improve the complexion. Mrs. Maybrick later stated that this had been her purpose, and such use of arsenic for cosmetic ends was indeed common and unremarkable in that era. However, the purchase of the flypapers, combined with the suspicions already entertained by the household staff and the nurse, served to fix attention upon Mrs. Maybrick as the source of her husband's distress. On the 11th of May, 1889, James Maybrick died at Battlecrease House. Immediately following Mr. Maybrick's death, suspicions that had been circulating privately were brought to the attention of his brothers, Edwin and Michael Maybrick. The brothers, convinced that foul play had occurred, pressed for an official inquiry. An inquest was convened, and it was held not in a proper courtroom but in a local hotel, a circumstance that would later be remarked upon as irregular. Maybrick's business associates and acquaintances heard testimony from the medical officers who had attended him during his final illness, and from the servants and nurses who had been present in the household. The body was exhumed on the 30th of May, some 19 days after death, and subjected to post-mortem examination. Though the quantity detected, approximately 1/10 of a grain in the liver, was noted by some medical authorities to be far below the amount ordinarily associated with a fatal poisoning. A lethal dose was commonly reckoned to be 2 grains or more. Nevertheless, the inquest jury returned a verdict that Mr. Maybrick had died from arsenic poisoning, administered by persons unknown. Suspicion fell immediately and solely upon Mrs. Maybrick, and she was arrested on the 14th of May, 1889, and charged with the willful murder of her husband. She was placed under house arrest initially, then removed to custody to await trial. Public interest in the case was immediate and intense, fed by reports in the newspapers that detailed the infidelity, the arsenic, and the suggestion of a young American woman having poisoned her respectable English husband for financial or romantic advantage. The trial of Florence Elizabeth Maybrick commenced on Wednesday, the 31st of July, 1889, at St. George's Hall in Liverpool, before Mr. Justice James Fitzjames Stephen. It continued for 1 week and became one of the most widely reported legal proceedings of the late Victorian period. The prosecution was led by Mr. John Addison, assisted by counsel. The defence was conducted by Sir Charles Russell, Q.C., a barrister of eminence, with Mr. William Pickford serving as his junior. The jury was composed of 12 men drawn from Lancashire, though not from the city of Liverpool itself. They were described as skilled artisans and tradesmen, plumbers, clerks, and men of similar station, none of whom possessed medical training or education in the sciences. The foreman, Thomas Wainwright, was a plumber from Southport. It was later remarked that the precautions for secluding the jury were scandalously neglected, a circumstance that raised questions about their exposure to public opinion and newspaper commentary during the course of the trial. The defence countered these points with evidence of Mr. Maybrick's own long-standing habit of taking arsenic. 3 witnesses were called from America, who testified to his habitual use of arsenic while resident in Norfolk. The chemist Edwin Heaton gave evidence that he had supplied Mr. Maybrick with arsenic-containing preparations over a period of 18 months, and that the doses had been progressively increased. The defence further argued that the quantity of arsenic found in Mr. Maybrick's body was consistent with chronic self-medication rather than acute poisoning, and that the symptoms he had exhibited prior to death were not conclusively indicative of arsenic poisoning. It was suggested that he may have died from natural causes, his system having been weakened by years of drug abuse and predisposed to gastrointestinal illness. A hairdresser was called to testify as to the common use of arsenic as a cosmetic, and a chemist spoke to the practice of women purchasing flypapers for purposes unrelated to the destruction of vermin. Sir Charles Russell argued that while Mrs. Maybrick may have had access to arsenic, there was no direct evidence that she had administered it to her husband. The case, he contended, was entirely circumstantial, and the burden of proof had not been met. However, the trial was marked by a critical error on the part of the defence. Mrs. Maybrick was permitted to make a statement from the dock, a highly unusual procedure at that time, and in the course of her statement, she made admissions that were deemed damaging to her case. She acknowledged having purchased the flypapers and having soaked them, though she maintained that her purpose had been cosmetic and not criminal. After the conclusion of the evidence, Mr. Justice Stephen delivered his summing up to the jury. It lasted for 2 days, an extraordinarily protracted address, and it has been the subject of severe criticism in the years since. Mr. Justice Stephen was at that time 69 years of age, and it has been suggested by medical historians that he was suffering from the effects of a stroke or other cerebral impairment. His summing up was described by contemporary observers as incoherent in places, rambling, and marked by factual errors. On at least one occasion, he was corrected by counsel for the Crown when he misstated a material point regarding the sequence of events. More significantly, the judge's address was heavily weighted against the prisoner. He dwelt at length upon Mrs. Maybrick's adultery, and he invited the jury to consider how they would feel if their own wives had behaved in such a manner. He stated, in effect, that a woman who was guilty of adultery was capable of murder, and that her moral failings were indicative of a character disposed toward criminal conduct. This conflation of adultery with murderous intent was entirely improper, and it has been remarked upon by legal scholars as a gross misdirection. The question before the jury was not whether Mrs. Maybrick was an adulteress that was admitted, but whether she had, beyond reasonable doubt, administered poison to her husband with the intent to kill him. Moreover, Mr. Justice Stephen made little reference to the evidence of Mr. Maybrick's habitual use of arsenic, and he did not adequately direct the jury's attention to the medical testimony that cast doubt upon the conclusion that death had resulted from acute poisoning rather than from chronic drug abuse. The summing up concluded with the judge telling the jury that they must solve, by intellectual means, an intellectual problem of great difficulty, a statement that placed an unreasonable burden upon 12 men of no scientific education, who had been subjected to 2 days of confused and prejudiced instruction. After retiring for deliberation, the jury remained out for approximately 38 minutes. Mrs. Maybrick was observed to sway in the dock. Mr. Justice Stephen then pronounced sentence of death in the customary form, ordering that she be taken from the place where she stood to a lawful prison, and thence to a place of execution, where she would be hanged by the neck until dead. As the judge left St. George's Hall, he was met with hostile demonstrations from large crowds that had gathered outside. In the days and weeks that followed the conviction, an extraordinary public movement arose in favour of Mrs. Maybrick. Petitions poured into the Home Office from all corners of the kingdom. One petition from the Liverpool Cotton Exchange alone bore 500,000 signatures. Meetings were held in Liverpool and London, and resolutions were passed calling for a reprieve or a new trial. Medical practitioners wrote to the authorities, arguing that the symptoms of arsenic poisoning during life and after death had been insufficient to support the verdict, and that the quantity of arsenic found in Mr. Maybrick's viscera was less than in any previous recorded case of fatal arsenic poisoning. Members of Parliament signed petitions. Letters were addressed to Queen Victoria and to the Prince and Princess of Wales. The American government, through its diplomatic representatives, made representations on behalf of a woman who had been born an American citizen. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic published editorials questioning the fairness of the trial. The Times, Daily Telegraph Times, and other journals criticised the conduct of the judge and the composition of the jury. It was widely stated that Mrs. Maybrick had been convicted not upon the evidence, but upon her moral character, and that the trial had become a trial of her adultery rather than of the charge of murder. On the 22nd of August, 1889, the Home Secretary announced his decision. The sentence of death would be commuted to one of penal servitude for life. The commutation was based not upon a finding of innocence, but upon doubts as to the sufficiency of the evidence. Mrs. Maybrick was spared the gallows, but she was not pardoned. She was to remain imprisoned for an indeterminate period, subject to the discretion of the Crown. Florence Maybrick was removed from the condemned cell and transferred to penal servitude. For the first 9 months of her imprisonment, she was held in solitary confinement, a practice then common for those under sentence of death or life imprisonment. Thereafter, she was subjected to the silent system, under which prisoners were prohibited from speaking to one another. She was also required to perform hard labour, which in the case of female prisoners typically consisted of laundry work, sewing, and other tasks deemed suitable to their sex. She remained imprisoned for 15 years, during which time she was denied contact with her children. Her son and daughter, James Chandler and Gladys Evelyn, were taken into the care of relatives and were raised with no knowledge of their mother. Maybrick was not permitted to see them, nor to correspond with them. Throughout her imprisonment, efforts continued to secure her release. Petitions were periodically submitted to successive Home Secretaries, and the case was kept before the public by sympathetic journalists and reformers. However, no further inquiry was ordered, and no pardon was granted. It was not until the 25th of January, 1904, that Mrs. Maybrick was released on license, having served 15 years of her life sentence. She was by then 41 years of age, older than her husband had been when they first met aboard the steamship Baltic. Part the 10th. The aftermath. Upon her release, Florence Maybrick returned to the United States. She sought to reunite with her children, but they had been raised to regard her as a murderess and would have nothing to do with her. She lived in obscurity, supporting herself by occasional writing and lecturing on prison reform. She published a memoir in which she maintained her innocence and recounted the injustices she believed she had suffered at the hands of the British legal system. The work was not widely read, and it did little to restore her reputation or her fortunes. Mrs. Maybrick died on the 23rd of October, 1941, in the town of South Kent, Connecticut. She was 79 years of age. She was buried in an unmarked grave, as she had lived the latter part of her life forgotten and impoverished. Her conviction was never overturned. Despite the manifest defects in the trial, and despite the public outcry that had attended her case, no formal inquiry was ever conducted, and no posthumous pardon was issued. It is of some significance that the case of Florence Maybrick was one of 4 cases cited when, in the year 1907, the Court of Criminal Appeal was established by Act of Parliament. The creation of that appellate court was prompted in part by recognition that the trial system as it then existed was capable of producing grave injustices, and that there was no adequate mechanism for correcting errors once a verdict had been delivered. Had the Court of Criminal Appeal existed in 1889, it is widely believed that Mrs. Maybrick's conviction would have been quashed on appeal, owing to the misdirections of the trial judge and the insufficiency of the evidence. Was Florence Maybrick guilty of murdering her husband? The evidence was circumstantial. The medical testimony was disputed. The judge was arguably incompetent. The jury was ill-equipped to assess the complexities of the case, and the verdict, once delivered, could not be challenged. What remains certain is that a young woman, married at 18 to a man more than twice her age, found herself trapped in a marriage marked by infidelity, financial strain, and addiction. When her husband died, possibly by his own hand through years of drug abuse, she was made to bear the full weight of public and judicial condemnation, not for what she had done, but for what she was, an adulteress in a society that demanded perfection of wives while excusing the transgressions of husbands. She was convicted, imprisoned, and forgotten, and the question of her guilt or innocence remains, to this day, unresolved. If you found this examination of the Florence Maybrick case of interest, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and to share your reflections in the comments.